Welcome to Boring History for Sleep, where the shadows of the medieval world unfold in whispers. Tonight, we journey through dark medieval tales, unveiling notorious serial killers, chilling legends, and forgotten crimes, all told in a calm, steady tone to guide you into restful slumber. In the medieval world, life was uncertain, fragile, and often short. Plagues swept through villages, famines emptied granaries, and wars marched across the fields without warning. Yet within this unstable landscape, darker figures walked silently, leaving trails of suspicion, fear, and whispered stories that endured for centuries. These were the murderers who did not kill in the heat of battle, nor in the open under the banners of kings, but who hunted in shadows, preying on the vulnerable, the trusting, and the desperate. Medieval serial killers were often hidden in plain sight, cloaked in the ordinary routines of life, blending among peasants, clergy, and even nobles, their names remembered not for acts of glory, but for crimes that seemed too monstrous to belong to the age of chivalry. One of the earliest figures to emerge from medieval chronicles was a woman known as the Hungarian noblewoman Erzsébet Báthory, though her story straddles the late Renaissance and has grown into legend. She is remembered in later folklore as a countess who lured girls to her castles, promising them work or education, only for them to vanish into silence. Witnesses in later centuries spoke of chambers where cruelty was methodically carried out, though historians debate how much was reality and how much was exaggeration fed by political enemies. Still, her image in collective memory reflects the fear that those in power, behind stone walls, could indulge in violence shielded from the eyes of villagers. Earlier still, in France, tales circulated of a nobleman named Gilles de Rais, once a companion in arms to Joan of Arc. After military campaigns ended, his estates became sites of rumors and investigations. He was accused of luring children with promises of employment or gifts, only for them to vanish into his castles. When confessions were drawn from servants, they spoke of rituals, of unspeakable acts, and of children who never returned to their families. Modern historians argue over whether these accounts were exaggerated by political and financial motives. Yet the medieval mind accepted such stories readily, for they resonated with existing fears of sorcery, possession, and demonic influence. Not all medieval killers were cloaked in nobility. In England, during the 14th century, village records preserve the existence of travelling criminals who pried on isolated households. A woman might open her cottage door to a traveller asking for water, and her disappearance would later be explained in fragments by neighbours who noticed her absence. Some of these crimes were attributed to roaming bands of outlaws, others to solitary men who moved from market town to market town, unrecorded and unremarked until suspicion gathered around them. The lack of modern policing meant that many such killers could move freely, their trails vanishing in forests, fields, and the unmarked graves of their victims. In Germany, darker stories became entangled with folklore about werewolves. During the 16th century, but echoing the medieval imagination, men were tried for crimes of murder and cannibalism, accused of donning the skin of wolves. The most infamous of these was Peter Stump, called the Werewolf of Bedburg, whose trial records tell of confessions under torture that described long years of killing livestock, children, and travellers. The medieval worldview often sought explanations for cruelty in the supernatural. A man who killed repeatedly might be said to have struck a pact with the devil, or to have transformed into something no longer human. Such interpretations reveal how communities struggled to comprehend the reality of serial violence without the frameworks of modern psychology or criminology. In Italy, chronicles tell of innkeepers who preyed upon guests travelling through lonely roads. Inns were places of both shelter and danger, for a wary traveller had little choice but to trust strangers with food, lodging, and safety. Stories circulated of beds rigged with mechanisms to drop the sleeping guest into hidden cellars, where they would be robbed, murdered, and buried beneath the floorboards. Whether all such stories were true or embroidered over time, they reflect a very real fear that hospitality could be a mask, and that a smile at the door could conceal a predatory design. The medieval world was also haunted by clergy who broke every oath of their station. In monastic records, accusations appear of priests or monks who lured children under the guise of charity, only to harm them. The betrayal of trust made these stories spread with greater force, for they suggested that evil did not merely stalk the roads or the forests, but could emerge within the very institutions meant to guard souls. Such cases were often covered in secrecy, yet the whispers lingered, forming part of the fabric of communal memory that painted the Middle Ages with shadows of corruption and cruelty. Another striking example comes from the city of Paris, a place already dense with rumors of crime. In the late 14th century, there were reports of two wealthy citizens who adopted children from poor families, promising them care and shelter. Instead, the children were said to vanish. Over time, the suspicions mounted until a dramatic investigation revealed that the household itself concealed atrocities. Details are scarce, buried under layers of chroniclers' exaggerations, but the story became part of Parisian legend, a tale parents would retell to caution their children against the dangers of strangers offering kindness. In Scotland, ballads and chronicles later preserved the name of Sawney Bean, a figure said to have lived in coastal caves with a large family. According to legend, they ambushed travellers, dragged them into their lair, and lived on their flesh. While the historical accuracy of Sawney Bean is questioned, the endurance of the tale reveals medieval fears about isolation and hidden communities cut off from the law. To imagine an entire family devoted to murder was to contemplate the collapse of morality itself, and the story survives because it represents the anxieties of an era when law enforcement was weak and vast stretches of land remained beyond the reach of justice. The psychology of medieval killers cannot easily be reconstructed, yet chroniclers occasionally attempted to describe motives. Greed was often cited, the hunger for wealth leading men to murder merchants and strip them of goods. Lust was another recurring explanation, especially in stories of nobles preying on servants or peasants. At times, accusations of sorcery or demonic influence filled the gaps, providing a supernatural justification for behavior that seemed inexplicable. Without the language of mental illness, medieval societies often explained repeated cruelty as the work of Satan, suggesting that the killer's soul had been surrendered in exchange for earthly power. Records from inquisitorial courts also reveal cases where traveling midwives or healers were accused of harming children under the guise of providing care. Communities sometimes believed these women offered remedies only for infants to perish. Though some of these accusations were clearly shaped by misogyny and fear of independent women, others may have reflected genuine cases where individuals took advantage of their position to commit harm. The difficulty lies in separating fact from rumor, for medieval chronicles rarely distinguished between proven crime and community suspicion. In villages along trade routes, suspicion often fell on butchers and tanners, men who worked daily with knives and blood. To kill animals was part of their livelihood, yet when a child or traveller disappeared, whispers would sometimes attach themselves to these figures, blurring the line between necessary labour and feared bloodlust. The association between certain professions and hidden violence reveals much about how medieval people projected their anxieties onto those who already lived on the edge of social respectability. Even kings and queens were not exempt from rumours of murderous behaviour. Chroniclers occasionally accused monarchs of eliminating rivals through poisonings or secret executions. While these were often political slanders, the idea that rulers might kill repeatedly, hidden beneath the trappings of law, reinforced the notion that serial cruelty could be institutional as well as individual. The line between lawful execution and private murder was thin, especially in courts where justice was whatever the ruler declared. And so, across the medieval centuries, stories of killers multiplied. Some were surely exaggerated or invented, while others reflected real individuals whose crimes shook their communities. The lack of centralized law enforcement, the difficulty of communication, and the isolation of many regions allowed such figures to operate longer than might seem possible today. Villages without sheriffs, roads without patrols, and towns without prisons created a world where killers could move silently, their presence known only by the growing number of graves left behind. Legends in the medieval world were never just simple stories told for entertainment. They were living frameworks through which people explained their world, half rooted in memory and half in imagination. And often they blurred into reality so deeply that no one could separate fact from belief. The medieval mind did not draw sharp lines between history and myth, And so kings, saints, outlaws, and mysterious strangers all shared the same space in chronicles and songs. A traveller moving from one village to another might hear of a knight who had ridden through the same forest only a generation earlier, or of a spirit that haunted a bridge, or of a warrior whose deeds were spoken of as if they had truly happened, and in this way reality and myth dissolved into each other like shadows at dusk. Among the most enduring tales of the Middle Ages were those surrounding King Arthur and his knights. Whether Arthur was a real king or merely a figure born from Celtic memory remains uncertain, but in the medieval imagination he was utterly real. Monks copied stories of Camelot into their manuscripts, poets sang of the Round Table, and pilgrims believed they might stumble across relics of Arthur's court in distant corners of Britain. At Glastonbury, monks even claimed to have found the graves of Arthur and Guinevere, and though many suspect it was a fabrication to attract pilgrims, the people who came to gaze upon the graves believed they were seeing history itself. The legend had grown so tightly woven into the culture that it did not feel like myth at all, but like a blurred continuation of reality where ancient kings could be found sleeping under the hills, ready to rise again. In Scandinavia, sagas carried the memory of gods, heroes, and explorers, their exploits described with as much detail as if they had been neighbours only a few decades past. Figures like Ragnar Lothbrok stood at the threshold between history and fable. Some chronicles place Ragnar as a real Viking who raided Paris and ruled over Denmark, while others depict him battling dragons and wearing magical garments. His sons, too, appear in the records of European courts, yet their stories are embroidered with so much poetry that one cannot tell where the real chieftain ends and the legendary hero begins. For the medieval listener, this lack of clarity did not matter, for the power of the tale was not in its factual accuracy, but in its ability to explain the character of a people, and to inspire those who heard it. The figure of Robin Hood is another example of this delicate blending. Ballads from the medieval period describe him as an outlaw hiding in Sherwood Forest, stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. The earliest references suggest he may have been based on a real outlaw, or a combination of several men who resisted the heavy taxation of their lords. Yet over centuries, the legend grew until Robin Hood was not just a thief, but a symbol of justice, chivalry, and defiance against tyranny. For medieval audiences, Robin Hood was both myth and reality, a figure who could be sung about in taverns, feared by sheriffs, and admired by commoners, all at once. In France and Germany, tales of saints often blurred into the miraculous, where stories of holy men and women took on qualities closer to legend than sober biography. A saint might be said to have slain a dragon, to have tamed wolves with a touch of the hand, or to have walked unharmed through fire. These accounts were copied into hagiographies and believed wholeheartedly by villagers who visited shrines in hope of miracles. When relics of these saints were displayed in cathedrals, pilgrims accepted them as tangible proof that the stories were real, even if the relic might have been the bone of an unknown animal or a fragment of cloth of uncertain origin. What mattered was that the legend gave meaning to suffering, hope to the sick, and a sense that the divine was present in the ordinary world. Wandering minstrels carried with them stories that stretched beyond the boundaries of the known world. They told of distant lands where giants roamed, where rivers flowed with milk and honey, and where people lived for hundreds of years without aging. These tales blended geographic rumor with legendary motifs, shaping the way medieval Europeans imagined lands they had never seen. The Crusades added fuel to these stories, for returning pilgrims brought back not only relics, but also tales of strange customs, unusual beasts, and cities filled with wonders. Some of these accounts were real observations of Middle Eastern culture, while others quickly grew into legends that could not be disproven in an age without mass communication. Legends also grew from tragedies. The story of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, for example, describes a mysterious figure who rid the town of rats with his magical pipe, only to lead away the children of the town when he was not paid. While historians speculate that it may reflect a real event such as disease, famine, or emigration, the legend was told in such a way that it became mythic, a haunting reminder of loss that felt both symbolic and historical. Medieval parents repeated the story as a warning to children, and the image of the piper, both savior and destroyer, lived on as a blurred figure between folklore and reality. Border regions were especially fertile ground for such tales. In the Carpathian Mountains, stories circulated of beings who drank the blood of the living. These accounts may have begun as attempts to explain disease or sudden death, yet they developed into the legends of vampires that haunted the imagination of Europe for centuries. Figures like Vlad of Wallachia, who defended his lands with ruthless cruelty, became mixed into these tales until his historical deeds were inseparable from the monstrous image of the vampire lord. For those living at the time, to hear of a cruel ruler impaling his enemies, and then to hear of stories of the undead was not contradictory. It was a natural blending of history with myth, for both expressed the same underlying fear of death and tyranny. Legends also softened the memory of disasters, giving them meaning through narrative. In the wake of the Black Death, stories arose of spectral figures seen wandering villages before outbreaks, cloaked in black and carrying scythes. Some said these were angels of death, others that they were witches spreading plague. Though no proof existed, the image of these figures entered collective memory and became part of how people described the otherwise inexplicable catastrophe. The legend explained what could not be scientifically understood, offering a narrative where none existed. Even everyday crimes could take on legendary form. A murder in a small town might, over decades of retelling, become a tale of ghostly revenge. A thief who disappeared might be said to wander the roads as a restless spirit. Medieval ballads delighted in these transformations, where ordinary misdeeds turned into timeless stories. For villagers sitting around the fire, it was not important whether the details were precise. What mattered was that the story lived, carried forward by each new voice, until it became part of the fabric of reality itself. At times, rulers themselves encouraged these legends, for they understood the power of myth in shaping loyalty. A king might spread tales of his divine ancestry, connecting himself to heroes of old. Charlemagne, for example, was woven into legends that made him not just a ruler, but a semi-mythical warrior blessed by God. Chroniclers wrote of him fighting giants and receiving holy relics from angels. Whether these events truly happened was less important than the fact that they bound his authority to a sense of the sacred and the eternal. To his subjects, this was not myth in the modern sense, but a truth that affirmed their place in a world guided by divine order. Across Europe, landscapes themselves became infused with stories that blurred myth and reality. A hill might be said to conceal sleeping knights who would awaken in the hour of the nation's need. A spring might be linked to a saint's miracle, its waters thought to heal sickness. Forest clearings were believed to be the dwelling places of fairies, and bridges were thought to have been built with the help of devils. These stories gave meaning to physical spaces, so that every journey became a passage through a land alive with both history and legend. The blending of myth and reality in medieval times was not seen as deception, but as a natural way of understanding the world. People did not demand proof in the modern sense, nor did they separate fact from imagination in the way we do today. To them, legends explained truths that were deeper than facts, truths about justice, about fear, about divine power, and about human frailty. Whether or not Arthur truly lived, whether or not Robin Hood actually robbed the rich, whether or not saints truly slew dragons, the stories carried weight. They shaped values, and they made sense of a world that was often harsh and uncertain. The medieval world was filled with crimes that slipped quietly into obscurity, recorded only in faint lines of parchment or whispered through the memories of small communities before being forgotten entirely. Unlike the legendary tales that grew brighter in retelling, these crimes often dissolved into the silence of history, their perpetrators and victims vanishing without lasting record. Yet for a brief moment, they were real, they were terrifying, and they shaped the lives of those who lived through them. To uncover them now is to step into shadows that once weighed heavily on entire villages and towns, only to disappear as generations moved on. In the early centuries, village courts often recorded disputes and accusations, and within these brittle accounts are glimpses of forgotten violence. A man accused of stealing grain might also be whispered to have beaten a neighbour's child, but the parchment only notes that he paid a fine, and so the darker act fades unacknowledged. A woman accused of poisoning a well may have been imprisoned for a season, but when she died, her name carried no weight beyond her parish. For every notorious killer or outlaw who became legend, countless others committed crimes that never echoed beyond the narrow borders of their community. Theft was one of the most common medieval crimes, yet behind the bland word theft were often stories of desperation and cruelty. To steal a loaf of bread in a famine could mean another villager went hungry, and resentment might fester into violence. Farm animals were often stolen at night, leading to quarrels that escalated into murder, and yet the records often reduced these events to brief notations such as a quarrel in the field, a death, a penalty paid. These lives were lived and lost, but because they lacked drama for the chronicler, they became forgotten crimes, remembered only by those directly harmed, and then carried into silence when they too passed away. Banditry on the roads was a constant danger. A traveller might set out with a pack of goods, and somewhere between towns he would vanish. Sometimes the body was discovered in a ditch, stripped of clothing. Sometimes it was never found at all. The families might suspect known outlaws, but if no confession was made and no justice pursued, the crime slipped away. In the medieval imagination, the forest was always a place of lurking danger. But while the stories of famous outlaws like Robin Hood survived, the countless nameless robberies and murders disappeared into the soil of the roads themselves. Some forgotten crimes were covered by silence, not because they lacked severity, but because they involved people too powerful to be named openly. A noble might order the quiet removal of a rival, and a chronicler in his employ would never record it. Servants might whisper of strange disappearances in the castle, of prisoners taken into dungeons and never seen again, but no record survives beyond rumour. In these cases, the crime was doubly forgotten, erased by deliberate silence, and lost through the absence of witnesses who could safely speak. Only centuries later do fragments of letters or legal disputes hint at darker events hidden behind the polished image of noble houses. In many towns, guilds controlled not only trade, but also local justice. Disputes among merchants could lead to bribery, assault, and even murder. But as long as the guild protected its own, the details rarely reached formal courts. A body found in a canal might be described as an accident, a drowning after too much drink, when in reality it had been a carefully arranged elimination. Such deaths blurred into the ordinary tragedies of life, and thus slipped into the long list of forgotten crimes. The medieval world also saw crimes of superstition, where accusations themselves destroyed lives. In a small village, an elderly woman blamed for a poor harvest might be beaten or killed by fearful neighbours, her death left unrecorded because no authority cared to pursue it. Inquisitorial records capture some of these accusations, but countless others went unremarked, leaving only gaps in parish lists where a name suddenly ceases to appear. For the people of that village, it may have been a moment of terror and cruelty, but for history it became only another crime lost to time. Maritime crimes were especially prone to disappearance. A ship leaving port with cargo and crew might vanish at sea, and survivors of wrecks sometimes spoke of mutiny, of captains murdered and goods stolen before the ship was abandoned. Yet these accounts were rarely verified, and most simply listed as lost at sea. The possibility of deliberate violence, of crimes committed far from the eyes of land, became absorbed into the natural dangers of the ocean. In this way, entire stories of betrayal and murder were swallowed by the waves, remembered only by those who witnessed them, and then carried into silence when they too were gone. Children often fell victim to crimes that vanished from memory. A missing child might be assumed to have wandered into the woods and perished, but sometimes suspicions of foul play lingered. Without formal investigation, the truth was never pursued. A child might be taken by strangers on the road, sold into servitude, or worse. But if no one could prove it, the disappearance became an unsolved mystery, explained away by chance rather than malice. For families left behind, the grief was real, yet history records nothing of these smaller tragedies, leaving them as forgotten crimes hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. Medieval cities with their crowded alleys, poor sanitation, and constant movement of people were fertile grounds for crime. Pickpockets and burglars thrived, but beneath the petty thefts were acts of violence that never reached chroniclers. Prostitutes were sometimes attacked, and killed in brothels or alleys, but unless the victim was wealthy or the killer caught, the crime was rarely noted. Drunken fights in taverns often ended in death, yet these too were minimized, written off as accidents of disorderly living. Entire neighborhoods lived with the constant reality of such dangers, but the lack of lasting records ensured that these daily crimes were soon forgotten. The phenomenon of forgotten crime also extended to times of war. When armies marched, looting and murder were common, but chroniclers often ignored the suffering of peasants to focus on the victories of kings. Villages burned, families killed, women assaulted, but the official records described only the movement of troops. For the villagers, these were crimes as real as any bandit's attack, yet in the language of history they became collateral, nameless tragedies swept aside by larger narratives. Thus, the crimes of war became some of the most widespread, yet most forgotten of all. Sometimes forgotten crimes left faint echoes in folklore. A pond said to be haunted might in reality have been a site where bodies were hidden. A ruined tower avoided by shepherds might once have been the scene of a murder. Generations later, no one remembered the details, but the unease remained, transformed into superstition. In this way, a crime lost to time survived only in the vague shape of a ghost story, stripped of names and dates, but still carrying a trace of its origin. The lack of centralized policing made many crimes invisible beyond their immediate locality. Sheriffs and bailiffs were few, their reach limited, and unless a crime disturbed a wealthy patron, it could vanish without notice. In rural areas, entire communities often preferred silence, resolving matters privately rather than inviting outside intervention. A killing might be settled by compensation, a feud might end in a quiet disappearance, and no record was ever made. To us now, these appear as blank spaces in history, but for those who lived then, they were vivid realities that consumed lives and shaped fates before fading away. Even the punishment of crimes contributed to their forgetting. Executions were public spectacles, but once the condemned was dead, the record often ceased. The details of the victims, the full account of the deeds, and the broader context were rarely preserved. The name of the criminal might linger briefly, but as generations passed, even that disappeared. Only the method of punishment remained in memory, the gallows on the hill or the scaffold in the square, symbols of justice without the details of the crimes they addressed. Thus, across the medieval centuries, the landscape was littered with forgotten crimes, each one real in its moment, each one altering the lives of victims and families, yet each one swallowed by the silence of time. Behind every sparse line in a manorial record, behind every missing name in a parish register, behind every vague superstition about a haunted place, lies a story of violence, theft, betrayal, or cruelty that once burned brightly and then went dark, leaving only the faintest trace.